And we are officially on the record. This is the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. Are both parties present and ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, can I have appearances from first the government?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I represent the United States in today's case. I'm joined by my second chair, Miss Elizabeth Grant, and you won't be able to see or hear from Miss Grant throughout today's trial. She'll be off screen helping me with the technological components of the case. We have a few preliminary matters to attend to after the defense makes their introductions.
Okay, defense?
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Michelle Rahimzada, and along with my co-counsel, Alexandra Farina, I will be representing the defendant in today's case, Kara Bassett.
Thank you, counsel. Ms. Bianchi, I think you said you had some preliminary stuff to go over before we get going.
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, constructively sequestering all witnesses barring party representatives. And in today's case, we have no party representative.
Defense?
Your Honor, we have no objection to that. We will state that Ms. Bassett is constructively here in court today.
Is she going to testify?
She will not be.
Okay. What else, government?
Next, we'd like to direct the court's attention to the pretrial order number 7, which states that exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted, that they're already in evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, I would just note one thing, that to the extent that you're going to refer to a pre-admitted exhibit, please just tell me that it's pre-admitted before you display it, just so we're on the same page, so that way I don't have to stop you and ask, why are you displaying this? Is this one of those pre-admitted exhibits? Everyone got
Yes.
it? Okay, great. What's next?
And lastly, we'd like to read stipulation 11 onto the record.
Okay.
It states, on August 18th, 2018, Leon County and the state of Florida declared Dawn Clark deceased.
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay.
And with that, the people are ready to proceed.
Okay. Defense?
Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed with trial.
Okay. Government, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, before we proceed with that, scoring judges, if you haven't changed to speaker view yet, we're about to hear opening statements from the party. So in the top right corner of your screen, it'll say speaker view. So you just click that now. And for the duration of both opening statements, we'd like you to stay in that view. And then we can switch back over to gallery view for the examinations of the witnesses and presentation of evidence. And I'll obviously give you a reminder before we do that to switch back to gallery view. Government counsel, whenever you're ready.
She killed for control. August 18th, 2017. A woman at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park walks to her storage unit, takes out her keys, lets herself in. It's there that she decides how she's going to end her husband's life. She grabs an elephant tranquilizer, 10 milligrams of a drug known as carfentanil, a drug that's 5,000 times more toxic than heroin. And this woman, she knows it. She knows it, and she uses it to kill her husband. Members of the jury, that woman is the defendant, Kara Bassett. And today we'll prove that she committed murder in the first degree when she ended her husband's life. Good morning. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I represent the people of the United States. Today we'll present a case about a plan, the execution of that plan, and the cover-up that followed. We'll present a case about how the defendant, she killed for control. The defendant and her husband ran the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, but you'll learn that they disagreed about how to run their business. The victim, Don Clark. He saw the park as profit. But the defendant? She saw animals in zoos as torture. This fundamental disagreement, this tension, it grew and it grew until in 2017, the defendant couldn't take it anymore. She developed a plan to make her husband disappear, to take control of the park and to turn it into an animal sanctuary herself. And you'll learn that this plan manifested itself months before Mr. Clark's disappearance in an unusual power of attorney document where the defendant herself instructed a lawyer to add a clause specifically concerning disappearance. And then on August 18th, he disappeared. But you'll learn today something else disappeared too. 1 syringe of elephant tranquilizer. Now, members of the jury, it's what happens right after the defendant's husband disappears that proves her connection to the case. FBI Special Agent Steph Johnson will explain how on the same night, on August 18th at 11:17 p.m., a van pulls out of the elephant park, drives 2 hours to a swamp across Florida, and then drives another 2 hours across the state to an airport, where the van is left empty, unlocked, and abandoned. And how does this connect to the defendant? You'll learn that 2 rare forms of algae were found at that swamp. Found together at the swamp, later found together inside the van on its gas pedal, and ultimately found in the defendant's own home on her shoes. Members of the jury today will prove that the defendant created a plan, executed that plan, and later tried to cover it up. Will prove that she killed for control. Will prove that she murdered her husband with malice aforethought, meaning she killed him willfully and deliberately. She killed for control. And at the end of today's trial, we'll come before you and ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. They have the wrong story. So they have the wrong person. And the prosecution just came before you and told you a story that seems to have everything. An out-of-control woman, a conveniently placed vehicle, a cold-blooded murder. The prosecution story seems to have everything. Everything, except evidence. Now, it's no doubt that when someone disappears without a trace, it's a tragedy. And when tragedy strikes, it's natural for us to look for a source of blame, to seek justice. But in seeking that justice, we must remember to be thorough, to base our conclusions on facts, not feelings, on evidence, not emotions. Because the prosecution just told you that Miss Bassett murdered her husband on the night of August the 18th and poisoned him with a tranquilizer. But members of the jury, they don't get to just say that. They have to prove it. Because the government has the burden today to prove each element of their murder charge beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard in the American legal system. And they won't be able to do that today. Because that story that Miss Bianchi just told you, a story of a woman who murdered her own husband in cold blood, is as dramatic as it is untrue. As you'll learn today that nothing like that ever happened. You'll learn today that Don Clark wasn't murdered in August of 2017. He was never murdered at all. Today, you'll learn that in August of 2017, Mr. Clark's own problems were closing in on him. So much so that he had to flee the country, and the only way to do that was to make it look like he was dead. You're gonna hear from an employee of the Clarks today. That employee was with Don Clark on the day that he disappeared. And he'll tell you that on that day, Mr. Clark received a call that scared him. And after that, he started putting in motion his plan to get away. After he received that call, Mr. Clark said he needed to deal with something. And hours later, his car was found at the airport and he was nowhere to be found. But you're also going to learn that the FBI never looked into any of that. Instead, they looked to Miss Bassett. And now Miss Bassett is on trial for a crime that they don't even know occurred, much less that she committed. They have the wrong story. So they have the wrong person. Members of the jury, I want you to remember just a few moments ago, you all swore an oath. An oath to presume Miss Bassett innocent throughout today's trial and throughout your deliberations. And that presumption does not give way unless the state can meet each and every element of their burden. That means that in this case, Miss Bassett is entitled to your presumption that the state got it wrong, that they have the wrong story, so they have the wrong person. And that's why, at the end of today's trial, we'll ask you to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Government, you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The people call Special Agent Johnson to the stand.
Okay. And Agent Johnson, you've been previously sworn.
Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
And Ms. Bianchi, if I could just stop you for 1 second, I apologize. I just want to remind all the scoring judges to switch over to gallery review now. Go ahead, sorry.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good morning, Agent Johnson.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background, Agent?
Yes, ma'am. I received my bachelor's degree from the University of Cincinnati. Afterwards, in 2002, I trained at Quantico, Virginia, where I was hired at the FBI office, and I've been there ever since.
How are you involved in today's case?
In August of 2017, I was contacted by an individual named Kara Bassett, where I was informed that her husband, Don Clark, was missing. Over the course of the year, I looked into her whereabouts of her husband and ultimately arrested Miss Bassett for murder.
Well, Agent, how did you approach this murder investigation?
I looked for a potential plan or motive, execution of that plan, and evidence connecting suspects to that crime.
Well, Agent, let's take those one at a time, starting with the plan. Did you ever find any evidence that the defendant may have had a plan in today's case?
Yes, ma'am. I discovered the victim's power of attorney during the investigation. It described the allocation of Mr. Clark's asset in the event of his death or disappearance.
Ms. Grant, could we put Exhibit 15 on the screen? Your Honor, it's one of those pre-admitted exhibits.
Thank you for the reminder.
Agent, is this the power of attorney document you're referring to?
Yes, ma'am. That is the victim's power of attorney. It says here that in the event of his death or disappearance, the defendant would seize all of his physical and financial assets.
Agent, to your knowledge, was there anything unusual about this power of attorney?
Yes, ma'am. Upon contacting lawyers, I learned that there was a letter in the victim's, Upon contacting Don Clark's lawyer, I learned that there was a letter who prepared the attorney of documents, which says that the actual phrasing upon my disappearance actually was it was a unique phrasing.
Ms. Grant, can we put Exhibit 4 on the screen? Your Honor, it's one of those pre-admitted exhibits as well.
Thank you for the
Agent.
reminder again. Sorry.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent, is this that letter you were referring to?
Yes, ma'am.
What does it say about the power of attorney being unusual?
Here it says that she's never seen a disappearance trigger clause in a power of attorney document in the entirety of her career.
Did the lawyer indicate why this clause was included?
Yes, ma'am. The defendant requested it.
Agent, in the event that Mr. Clark disappeared, who was to gain control of his assets?
The defendant.
And do you know who gained control of his assets after his disappearance?
Yes, ma'am. It was the defendant exactly 1 year after his disappearance.
Agent, let's shift gears. Are you familiar with a drug called carfentanil?
Yes, ma'am. It's an elephant tranquilizer.
Do you know if the defendant had access to that elephant tranquilizer?
Yes, ma'am. There were syringes of the drug that were kept in a storage unit at the defendant's park.
Do you know if that drug is dangerous?
Based on a drug information sheet that I saw, yes.
Ms. Grant, can we put Exhibit 17 on the screen? Once again, Your Honor, it's one of those pre-admitted exhibits. Is this that information report that you read about the syringes, Agent?
Yes, ma'am.
What did you learn from this document?
I learned that this was a toxic substance that is 5,000 times more lethal than heroin.
5,000 times more toxic than heroin. Agent, do you know if the defendant knew how dangerous this drug was?
I asked the defendant about this drug and she responded that yes, she knew.
Agent, in August of 2017, was all of the park's carfentanil accounted for?
No, ma'am. There was one syringe missing.
Agent Johnson, earlier you mentioned that as a part of your investigation, you looked for evidence connecting suspects to the case. Did you ever find any evidence connecting the defendant to the alleged murder?
Yes, ma'am.
What was it?
We actually found GPS evidence of a van that left the Elephant Park the night that Don Clark disappeared, and we ultimately found physical evidence connecting the defendant to that same van.
Well, let's break that down for the members of the jury. Ms. Grant, can we get Exhibit 31? It's one of those pre-admitted exhibits. Agent, is this the GPS data you were referring to?
Yes, ma'am.
What does it show? Where does it show the van went?
We see here that the van left the park at approximately 11 p.m., drove 2 hours across the state to a federal swamp, and then turned around and then drove 2 hours back to an airport where the van was eventually abandoned.
And Agent, when did this van make that 4-hour trip?
This was the night that Don Clark had went missing.
And you mentioned that you found physical evidence connecting the defendant to that van. What was that?
Yes, ma'am. Well, we took samples from that federal swamp of several different types of algae. We found 2 rare forms of algae at that swamp, and we were able to match that to several of the defendant's belongings.
Ms. Grant, can we get Exhibit 5 on the screen, please? It's already in evidence. Is this that document you're referring to about the algae tests?
Yes, ma'am. That's our forensic report.
What did it tell you about the algae found at the swamp?
Well, it told us that the algae found at the swamp was actually a combination of 2 rare forms of microscopic algae. Yes.
Agent, are you aware if it's rare to see those 2 forms of algae together?
Yes, ma'am. So not only were the algae rare, that they were rare to find them together.
Did you find these 2 rare forms of algae anywhere else?
Yes, ma'am. We found them on several of the defendant's personal belongings.
Did you find them inside the van?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
Where on the van did you find this algae?
On the pedals of the van.
You mentioned you found it on the defendant's belongings. What belongings did you find the algae on?
It was her boots.
Based on this evidence, what did you do?
After we discovered that there was a match to this algae, we proceeded to arrest the defendant for the murder of Don Clark.
Thank you, Agent. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross,
Yes, Your Honor.
proceed.
Detective Johnson, could you tell the members of the jury exactly how long you and your team looked for Mr. Clark's body before you decided to give up?
We proceeded with the investigation for about a year, ma'am.
So for about a year, you searched for that body.
Yes, ma'am.
And to this day, you've never found it.
That is correct, ma'am.
Let's talk about why that is. Today, you're alleging that Miss Bassett disposed of her husband's body in the swamp, right?
That is the prevailing theory, yes.
Well, it's your theory.
Our crime investigation unit's theory, yes.
And your theory is that she transported that body in a van.
That is correct, ma'am.
In fact, you have the exact coordinates of where the van was parked at the swamp that night.
That is correct, ma'am.
And so you went to that coordinate, right?
That's correct.
You went to that swamp.
Yes, ma'am.
And you would recognize a picture of that swamp if I were to show it to you.
Of course,
That's
ma'am.
Exhibit 28 already in evidence. So you went to the swamp, to those coordinates that the van was parked at, and you searched.
That's correct.
And you searched in that area because you knew Miss Bassett couldn't have gotten very far.
That's correct, ma'am.
You know that that van was only parked at the swamp for 36 minutes that night.
The van itself was parked there for around 36 minutes. That's correct.
For exactly 36 minutes, it was parked at the swamp.
Yes, ma'am.
So you brought your team out there.
That's correct, ma'am.
You brought a team of trained dogs.
Yes, ma'am.
And that canine unit was trained to sniff out Mr. Clark's scent.
That's correct, to the best of their ability.
And again, you never found the body from that search.
No, ma'am, it's a 13,000 acre square park, so we were not able to find the body.
Detective, I'm not asking you about the 13,000 square miles of that park. I'm asking you about the coordinates that you searched at, and you didn't find the body there.
Not at those specific coordinates, nor the rest of the park that we were able to search.
So let's talk about what other evidence you weren't able to find. You were never able to locate a murder weapon in today's case.
That is correct, ma'am.
Again, you claim you know what that murder weapon is.
We believe it to be one of the fatal syringes of elephant tranquilizer.
Yes, exactly. You believe it was a syringe of carfentanil.
That's correct, ma'am.
But again, detective, you weren't able to locate that exact syringe of carfentanil.
That's correct.
Because you didn't have that syringe, you were never able to conduct any testing on it.
That's correct, ma'am.
You were never able to conduct any DNA testing to look for fingerprints of Miss Bassett on that syringe.
On the syringe, no, we weren't able to.
You also allege that that syringe was used to poison Mr. Clark that night.
That is what we believe, ma'am.
But detective, you were never able to perform a toxicology screen on Mr. Clark's body.
No, ma'am, we never recovered the body, so we were not able to perform a toxicology screening.
So you were never able to confirm that any traces of that drug existed in Mr. Clark's body at any point in time.
That's correct, ma'am.
In fact, you weren't able to conduct any autopsy.
That's correct. Once again, we were not able to recover the body.
Yeah, you'd need a body for an autopsy.
That's correct.
I want to talk a little more.
Hang on one second. I didn't hear the whole objection, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. Objection to asked and answered. We made clear that the body was never found at this point and been asked and answered.
All right, given that it's cross-examination, I'm going to give counsel a little bit of leeway, but feel free to re-raise the objection if you think counsel goes too far.
Yes, Your Honor.
So detective, I want to talk a little more about the story that you claim happened on August 18th.
Okay.
You claimed that Miss Bassett drove her husband's body out to the Big Gum Swamp 200 miles from her home.
139 miles. That's correct, ma'am.
You believe that she transported that body herself.
We believe with an aid of a wheelchair.
Detective, you're aware that Miss Bassett is a 5'4" woman, right?
That is our understanding, ma'am.
And her husband was 6'5".
That's correct, ma'am.
You believe that that woman transported her husband's 6'5" body into a truck and then again took it out of that truck to put it in the swamp?
Again, ma'am, we believe that she used a wheelchair to wheel the body into the truck, out of the truck, into the truck, etc.
And I also want to take a look at that wheelchair that you say she used. You'd recognize a picture of it if I were to show it to you in court.
Of course, ma'am.
Right, that exhibit's already in evidence. This is the wheelchair that you allege Miss Bassett used that night.
That is a wheelchair, ma'am, yes. That is the wheelchair.
That's the wheelchair that you say you found those particles on.
Yes, correct. That same form of algae that is found at that federal swamp.
Detective, you can take a look at that wheelchair. It doesn't appear to have any algae on it, right?
The algae is microscopic, so you wouldn't be able to see it with.
Hang on a second. I think there's an objection. Go ahead, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. Objection to lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Sure.
Ms. Rahimzadeh said that it's impossible for us to see any spots of algae on this wheelchair. We actually have in evidence a report done on this wheelchair that there is algae particles on this wheelchair. For her to say that just because you can't see it means, for her to imply that because you can't see it means that they're not there, lacks foundation.
Response?
Your Honor, there is no further foundation that we need to lay. I asked this witness whether he's able to observe any debris on the wheelchair. That's something he can testify to himself. That's something he can rationalize with his 5 senses.
If I may, Your Honor?
Yeah, please.
Just because he can't visually see debris on the wheelchair, it doesn't mean it's not present. And in fact, we have in evidence that it is present.
Okay, I think it's within his rational perception to testify as to what he can observe visually on the exhibit, and the jury can certainly take that for what it's worth. And you can redirect on that point if you'd like. So I'm going to overrule your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Detective, you can't see any visible debris on that wheelchair.
Ma'am, the algae is microscopic, so you would not be able to see it with the naked eye.
Okay, Detective. So now that we've talked about the evidence that you weren't able to recover from the swamp that night, I want to talk about some evidence that you might have ignored. You're aware that Mr. Clark was planning to engage in some financial transactions overseas.
I'm unsure what you mean by that.
Well, Detective, you received a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney in September of 2018.
That's correct, ma'am.
Right, you'd recognize that document if I were to show it to you, right?
Yes, ma'am.
That's Exhibit 4 in evidence. Right. Ms. Farina, could we get Exhibit 4 onto the screen? Now, Detective, according to this letter, Mr. Clark was looking at some property to acquire in Costa Rica.
That's what the letter indicates, yes.
According to that letter, he was looking to close on those properties right away.
That's correct, ma'am. That's what it says.
And according to that same letter, he was planning to acquire those properties with cash that was off the books.
That is what is indicated, yes.
And it also says in that letter that Mr. Clark was planning to move a portion of his assets overseas to Costa Rica.
That's what it says, ma'am.
Detective, you're also aware of a call that Mr. Clark received on the date of his disappearance.
That's correct, ma'am. We had all of his call logs.
Right, so you had evidence that at 6 p.m. on that day, he received a call from an unlisted number.
That's correct, ma'am.
That number was listed as coming from Costa Rica.
That's correct, ma'am.
And just 10 hours after Mr. Clark received that call, his car was parked at the airport.
That's what I remember in terms of the timeline. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your time. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent, you were just asked some questions about a murder weapon. Were you ever able to find the murder weapon in today's case?
No, ma'am, we were never able to recover the alleged syringe that was used.
Agent, do you know whether one of the syringes of tranquilizer was missing from the elephant park?
Yes, ma'am, we do know. They keep logs of how many tranquilizers they should have, and that there was one unaccounted for.
Do you know who the last person to log one of those tranquilizers was?
Yes, ma'am, it was Kara Bassett.
Agent, you were also asked about the transportation of a body to the swamp. Did you ever find any evidence that the defendant used a mechanism to carry that body?
Yes, ma'am, like I said before, we believe that Kara Bassett used a wheelchair to transport the body of Don Clark.
Ms. Grant, can we show that exhibit of the wheelchair? It's already in evidence. Agent, did you find any physical evidence on this wheelchair connecting it to the swamp?
Yes, ma'am. Like I said before, we did find those two forms of microscopic algae that matched the same forms of algae that were found at the federal swamp.
And where did you find this wheelchair?
We found that in the possession of the defendant.
Lastly, Agent, you were just asking questions about Costa Rica and that the van was parked at the airport. Did you find any evidence that Mr. Clark flew on August 18th, 2017?
No, ma'am. We know that he owned a plane and his plane was in his canopy at the airport.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Recross?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
Detective, I want to show you that same photo of a wheelchair. That's Exhibit 28. Detective, you're saying today that you found some microscopic forms of algae on that wheelchair.
Not me personally, it was our forensics team.
Right. Well, Detective, your theory claims that Miss Bassett took that wheelchair into the swamp.
That's correct, ma'am.
Right, she rolled this wheelchair over the mud and dirt of the swamp to put her husband's body into it, right?
That's correct, ma'am.
But there's no visible debris on this wheelchair.
Again, ma'am, the algae is microscopic, so you wouldn't see any of that debris on this wheelchair.
Okay, Detective. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Counsel, I assume we're done with this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. And may the witness be allowed to step down?
Sure. Government, what else do you have?
Your Honor, we rest our case in chief.
Okay. Defense, are you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this point, the defense calls Joe Kwong to the stand.
Okay. Ms. Kwong, remember you've been previously sworn.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Kwong, I'm sorry, please introduce yourself, spelling your last name for the record.
Hello, my name is Joe Kwong. That's K-U-A-N-G.
Ms. Kwong, what do you do for a living?
I film documentaries. My work usually starts out nature, animals, but the nature of my work has kind of shifted. Now it's more 60 minutes, sudden disappearance type of stuff.
And how are you familiar with today's case?
Well, I'm familiar with this case because I started working with Kara Bassett back in 2015. I'm filming a documentary called Elephant Queen. That's about Miss Bassett and their elephant park.
And did you know Don Clark?
Yeah, of course I knew Mr. Clark. I spent nearly every day at the elephant park, so I'm pretty familiar with he and Miss Bassett.
And how long were you working with the couple?
Well, I've been working with them since 2015 when I started the documentary.
And in the time that you were working with the couple, were you able to form any sort of relationship with them?
Yeah, I was with them pretty much every day, so we became pretty close. I got close to Mr. Clark too. He would even, one time he took me up on his airplane. He loved to fly.
And how would you describe the relationship between Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark in the time that you observed it?
From what I could see, they were affectionate. He would often indulge Miss Bassett and get her a lot of gifts, and she loved to tease him. They did have their disagreements, but I guess that's what couples do.
And in the 4 years that you were with the couple, did you ever see them physically injure one another?
No, nothing like that.
I want to talk about Mr. Clark specifically. In the 3 years that you were working with the couple, was Mr. Clark always at the park?
Yeah. Sometimes he would leave for Costa Rica, but for the most part, I observed him and Miss Bassett at the park a lot.
And how often would you say Mr. Clark traveled out of the country to Costa Rica?
Quite a bit. Usually he would, every couple of months, go to Costa Rica. He had a house on the beach there, and he would take his private jet.
Are you aware of what Miss Bassett's reaction was to Mr. Clark traveling to Costa Rica?
Yeah, he would go about 6 times a year, and that seemed to make Kara a little upset. She would complain and say, "Why aren't you taking me with you?"
And did you ever see Miss Bassett?
Yeah, I think there's an
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay to the defendant's statements.
response.
Your Honor, I believe the exact statement from the witness was a question. Why don't you take me with you? There is no inherent truth value, and as such, it is in hearsay.
Response to that.
Your Honor, this is an out-of-court statement being offered for the truth of the matter, and it is the defendant's statements. They're using this testimony about the defendant's reaction to his trips to Costa Rica to show that when he went to Costa Rica, she was unhappy.
Okay, given that it's a question and not a statement under Rule 801A, I'm going to overrule the objection. Proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Kwong, were you at the park the day that Mr. Clark disappeared?
Yes, I was there on August 18th, 2017.
And did you interact with Mr. Clark at all that day?
I did. Things were normal for the most part. He was just doing his job like he usually did.
And at any point, did you witness Mr. Clark receive any communications?
Yeah, we were talking at about 6 p.m. that night, and all of a sudden he got a text message. He looks down at his phone, and I noticed that his face, the color started to flush out of it, and he got a little pale.
Ms. Kwong, during your interviews about this case, were you ever made aware of call logs from Mr. Clark's phone?
Yeah, they showed it to me in the interview that I had.
And you would recognize that document if I showed it to you in court today?
Yeah, I see it on the screen right there.
Your Honor, for notice, this document is already admitted into evidence. Ms. Kwong, could you read for me the 2 text messages highlighted there on that page that Mr. Clark received at 6 p.m.?
Sure. It says, "Llámame inmediatamente."
And does it say on that page where those text messages were received from?
Costa Rica. Excuse me, I believe I have motion sensor lights that just turned off on me.
No.
Would Your Honor permit me to stand up and just turn those on?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. My apologies.
Not a problem.
Ms. Kwong, I want to talk about what happened after Mr. Clark's disappearance. Now, did you continue to work with Ms. Bassett after Mr. Clark disappeared?
Yes, I continued to work at the park, and I continued to work on the documentary.
And how did Ms. Bassett seem to you after her husband went missing?
She was upset. I had never really seen her that upset before, and she seemed pretty unhappy.
Were you at the park when the FBI began their investigation of the property?
Yes, I was there continuing to film for the documentary.
How long would you say that the FBI was at the park for?
They were there from about August 26th to September 3rd.
And did they ever return after September 3rd?
Yeah, but only about just once a month to ask a few questions.
In the entire time that the FBI was at the park, did anyone approach you asking you to write an affidavit? No one approached me asking me to do that. Did the FBI interview you at all during the course of their investigation?
Honestly, I had one interview, but they didn't really ask me much.
Ms. Huang, did the FBI ever ask you to provide any video evidence you may have had of the defendant and her husband?
No, and honestly, that's what surprised me the most because I had over 2,000 hours of footage.
Ms. Huang, on the day that Mr. Clark went missing, did he say anything to you?
Well, but when I was talking about before, when he got those text messages, when he saw that on his phone, he told me, I need to deal with this. And then didn't see him after that.
Thank you, Ms. Huang. I have no further questions.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Kwong. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I'm going to be asking you a few questions today on behalf of the people of the United States, all right?
Okay.
Let's start by talking about your relationship with the defendant. She hired you to film a documentary, right?
That's correct. Elephant Queen.
The defendant paid you $5,000 a month for over 3 years to make this documentary, right?
That's true.
So the defendant herself paid you over $150,000, right?
That's correct, because I spent pretty much every day at her elephant park filming.
She also gave you 20% of the equity in the documentary, right?
Well, she didn't actually give me anything yet, but she told me I would make 20% of whatever profit she made from the documentary.
That's right, Ms. Kwong. It's your belief that you'll have 20% equity in the documentary when it's sold, right?
That's true.
So if the documentary were to be sold, you'd make money.
I would.
And given the attention of today's trial, you're still making that documentary, aren't you?
I'm still making that documentary regardless of whether or not there's a conviction in this case.
But given the attention of today's trial, Ms. Kwong, you'd agree you're still making that documentary, right?
That's true.
And one of your episodes is even about the disappearance of Dawn Clark.
Yes.
Ms. Kwong, let's move to talking about the relationship you witnessed between the defendant and her husband. You told us that you spent almost every day with them for 2 years, that you were intimate and with knowledge of their relationship. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with the two.
You told us on direct examination. You knew they disagreed often.
Yes, about the way the park was being run.
That's right. Mr. Clark, he wanted to run the park like a business. True?
Yes.
But the defendant, she wanted to run it as an animal sanctuary.
Yes, Kara really cared about the animals.
You'd see them fight over this specific disagreement several times. Isn't that true?
That's true.
Ms. Kwong, at this time, I'd like to direct your attention to what's been pre-marked as Exhibit 36 in the digital binder.
Hang on,
I got it. You got it up.
Did you say 36?
Yes.
Is that one of the videos?
Yes. Is that a video that you took of the defendant?
That's true.
And is it a fair and accurate representation of that video as you remember it?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, we move Exhibit 36 into evidence.
Okay.
Your Honor, there is no objection.
Okay, it's in.
Your Honor, permission to play that exhibit for the members of the jury?
Sure.
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Now, Ms. Kwong, when the defendant said, "We'll see how this ends," that was 2 months before her husband went missing, right?
That was in mid-June, so yes.
Right, and he went missing in August of that same year.
Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it true that the defendant once told you, "One day I'll have the largest animal sanctuary in the United States"?
Yes, she said that to me once.
Ms. Kwong, let's move on now and talk about medical equipment that you're familiar with at the park. Now, you told us that you spent every day there. You're familiar with medical equipment in a locked storage unit, right?
Yes, they have some syringes of elephant tranquilizer in case there's any medical emergencies.
That's right. You knew where those syringes were kept.
The storage facility.
And you knew that the defendant, she had access to all of those syringes, right?
She did, but to my knowledge, there was about a dozen keys available.
But you'd agree that you knew that the defendant had access to those syringes, right?
She was one of about a dozen people who did, yes.
Ms. Kwong, let's move on now to talk about what happened after the defendant took control of the animal park. You told us on direct examination, you still filmed with her for months, right?
That's true.
And Ms. Kwong, I'd like to direct your attention again to the digital binder, this time to what's been pre-marked as Exhibit 44. That's another video you took of the defendant, right?
Yes, on Christmas Eve.
Is it a fair and accurate representation as you remember?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, we move Exhibit 44.
There is no objection.
So admitted.
Permission to play Exhibit 44 for the jury?
Yes.
It's Christmas Eve. Don's not here, and I miss him very much. I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Ms. Kwong, in this video, the defendant said she missed her husband while smiling, right?
I mean, that's what happened, but I found that through working with Miss Bassett for so many years that her demeanor and her facial expressions sometimes wouldn't fit with the feelings that she was expressing.
Ms. Kwong, I'm not asking what you found with her demeanor over the course of years. I'm asking in this video specifically, the defendant said she missed her husband while smiling, right?
She did.
And that video, that was taken a few months after Mr. Clark's disappearance, right?
In December, yes.
And when that video was filmed, she'd already gained control of the animal park, right?
Objection lacks foundation.
Response.
Your Honor, this witness told us that she spent months with the defendant after Don Clark's disappearance, and that she already testified to knowing that the defendant created an animal park, created an animal sanctuary from the park. She's familiar with the fact that the defendant took control.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
This witness has testified that she spent time at the park, she spent time with the defendant, but counsel's exact question was whether Miss Bassett took control of that park. We haven't heard any foundation that this witness is familiar with the exact ownership of the park, who was running it. That's not on the record.
Counsel, I agree with defense counsel in that we haven't heard that this witness hasn't said that she knew who took control of the park subsequent to Mr. Clark's disappearance. I'm not saying the witness doesn't know, but to the extent that you want to lay some foundation as to how she knows that or whether she knows that, I think that's warranted here. So I'm going to sustain the objection pending that foundation.
Motion to strike the question.
Stricken.
Ms. Kwong, when that video was recorded, the park was an animal sanctuary, right?
Yes. Kara had gotten rid of the elephant cages and she wasn't allowing the guests to get close to the elephants like they were allowed to before.
That's right. And the defendant, she was running the sanctuary when that video was taken.
Objection lacks foundation.
Hang on a second. So what government counsel, what is your response to the foundation objection?
Your Honor, the witness just stated that she knew Kara, the one who didn't put animals in cages, didn't let people close to the elephants, and that she created the sanctuary. By asking her if Kara was in charge of the sanctuary, I'm simply asking this witness to confirm what she's already said.
May I respond?
Sure.
Your Honor, that's not what we heard. This witness testified that she had gotten rid of the cages, that she wasn't allowing people close to the elephants, but what prosecution counsel has asked this witness is whether she was in control of that park. And we simply don't have any foundation on the record that she knew who had legal ownership of that park and who had the capacity to make those changes.
If I may, Your Honor.
One more response, yeah.
The question was changed and did not have control of the question. I did not ask her to opine any legal conclusion. I asked her if she knew who was running the park. And she told us that she knew that Kara was in charge.
Okay, let me ask you this, defense counsel. Is it your contention that this witness doesn't know who was running the park subsequent to Mr. Clark's disappearance?
Yes, Your Honor.
So you contend that she doesn't know that?
Well, we don't have that on the record, Your Honor.
Well, but my question is it your contention that this witness does not and will not be able to answer that question one way or the other?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. So here's what I'm going to allow government counsel to do. I'm going to allow you to ask your question as phrased because I think it's close enough given that this witness was at the park. And to the extent that defense counsel is correct and she doesn't know, she'll say that. And so I think we'll solve the problem that way. So overruled, I'm going to allow you to ask the question with the phrasing that you told me you were going to, how you were going to ask it. So overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Kwong, when that video was filmed, the defendant was running the animal sanctuary, right?
I don't know if she had the legal ownership of it, but from what I observed, she changed the way the park was being run.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay. Do you have any redirect?
There is no redirect, Your Honor.
All right. So we're done with this witness then, I assume?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Kwong, you're excused. Are both parties ready to proceed to closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, before we proceed, I'm going to remind the scoring judges to switch over to speaker view in the top right corner of your screen. And just hang on one second. Okay, Ms. Bianchi, whenever you're ready to go.
Yes, Your Honor. Control. It's a thing we all strive for. Control creates stability, comfort, safety. Control in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but control at all costs? The defendant took what is a basic human instinct and she perverted it. Took it to the extreme, killed for it. She killed for control. In the months leading up to August 18th of 2017, the defendant was running out of options she could accept. Her husband, her partner, he wouldn't listen to her. He wouldn't change how they ran their business. The defendant, she couldn't take it anymore, and she made a plan. She took steps. The power of attorney agreement. You learn that that wasn't a normal agreement. Signed months before her husband disappeared, the defendant instructed the lawyer to add a specific clause around disappearances. So unusual, this clause was so unusual that the attorney who was in charge of the document had never heard of it before. Members of the jury, she created a plan. I'm sorry, Your Honor, we're having some technical issues.
Not a problem. Just take a second to fix what you got to fix.
Yes, Your Honor. You never know what you're going to get with this type of setup.
It's been good so far.
Yes. Right. The power of attorney agreement, the one you see on the screen. You learn that it wasn't a normal agreement, signed months before her husband ever disappeared. The defendant herself asked for a specific clause to be inserted into this document, one concerning disappearance. It was so unusual that the attorney who was in charge of the document had never heard of it before. The defendant created a plan, and she had one decision left to make, to end her husband's life. And on August 18th, she made that decision. You heard that she had access to incredibly toxic animal tranquilizer. 10 milligrams of carfentanil, a drug so strong that it was 5,000 times more toxic than heroin. A few drops from one syringe could kill her husband. The defendant knew that. And one syringe of this tranquilizer, it went missing, along with her husband. As plan turned to execution, execution turned to cover-up. The defendant had to get rid of her husband's body. So you learned that later that same night, the defendant's van left the elephant park, drove 2 hours across Florida to a swamp, and then drove 2 hours across the state to an airport where the van was left emptied and abandoned. You see, the problem for the defendant is that she could control the disposal of the body, but she couldn't control the microscopic algae that gave her away. Two rare forms of algae rarely ever seen together, both found at the swamp, and both of those rare forms of algae were found inside the van on the gas pedal. Both were found on the defendant's shoes back at the elephant park. Plan, execution, cover. In just a few moments, the defense is going to give you their closing argument. And as they give you their argument, I want you to ask yourselves, is this a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that a meticulously kept logbook for those syringes is missing one that the defendant can't answer for? Is it a coincidence that on the night Don Clark went missing, one of the park's own vans went to a swamp, went to an airport, and we have no evidence that Don Clark ever got on a flight that night? No boarding passes, and in fact, his private plane is still at the airport. Is it a coincidence that two rare forms of algae were found at the swamp on a wheelchair, in the van, and at the defendant's home on her shoes? Evidence like that just doesn't pile up against innocent people. It's not a coincidence at all. She wanted control, and she killed for control. The defendant wanted control of the business, wanted control of her husband's life. She took control. She tried and she failed to take control of the evidence that gave her away. Members of the jury, look at all of the evidence. The defendant, she was in control, but now you are in control. So when you go back to the jury room to deliberate, ask yourselves, was it a coincidence? Where is the syringe? Look at that algae evidence, and look how happy the defendant is now, because members of the jury, you saw today, she couldn't be happier that her husband's gone and that she has that elephant sanctuary. She killed for it. She killed for control. That's why we'll ask you for the only reasonable verdict in today's case. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
Opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. They have the wrong story, so they have the wrong person. The prosecution just told you a horrifying story about what happened on the night that Don Clark disappeared. And about some things, they're right. Someone drove his van out to the Big Gum Swamp that night. Someone took that vehicle back to the airport and left it there. Someone made sure that Don Clark was never seen again. But that person is not Kara Bassett. This is Kara Bassett. She's a woman who trusted her husband with her dreams of building an animal sanctuary, and time again was let down by him. Members of the jury, she married someone who lied to her. So of course, her marriage was not always perfect. But you're not here today to decide whether or not Miss Bassett was a perfect wife. You're here to judge whether she committed this crime, whether the prosecution has the right story, whether Miss Bassett is the right person to blame. Because the prosecution had to do more today than show you a crime occurred. They had to prove to you that that crime was a murder. And they had to prove to you that Miss Bassett is the one who did it. They had to bring you sufficient evidence and credible witnesses to convince you that there is no other reasonable alternative. There is no other reasonable explanation for what happened that night. But if you think they might have the wrong story, if you think they might have the wrong person, that is reasonable doubt. And you can't find Miss Bassett guilty. So what really happened that night? Where did Mr. Clark go? Well, today you heard evidence that Mr. Clark was making plans to leave the country long before August 18th, and that the FBI did nothing about it. You saw a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney today. That's Exhibit 4. You're going to have that document when you go back to deliberate. And when you get it, I want you to look over it and count just how many times Mr. Clark says that he has plans to move his businesses overseas, that he wants to acquire new properties, that he wants to pay with cash off the books, that he's looking to close right away. You're going to have that evidence. Then, members of the jury, you heard from an employee of Mr. Clark today that on the day of his disappearance, he had a reason to put that contingency plan in place. At 6 p.m., he received a call that changed his entire demeanor. And after that call, he told Miss Kwong he needed to deal with something. And at 1 a.m., Mr. Clark drove out to the swamp to deal with whatever that thing was. And hours later, his car was at the airport. Members of the jury, you heard from the prosecution today that Miss Bassett had a plan, that she executed it, and then she covered it up. But that's not what we have evidence for today. You heard that the prosecution couldn't bring you any evidence to show Miss Bassett drove the car that night, that any violent attack happened to Mr. Clark. They couldn't bring you any of that evidence. All they could bring you evidence for is that a vehicle registered in Mr. Clark's name drove out to the swamp that night and then ended up at the airport. And they want you to believe that Mr. Clark couldn't have left the country because his plane was right there, but members of the jury, think about that. If Mr. Clark was truly trying to escape the country, would he take a plane that's registered in his name from the hangar that is also known to house that vehicle? No. They have the wrong story. So they have the wrong person. Members of the jury, I want you to remember that the defense doesn't have a burden in today's case. We didn't have to bring you evidence to prove our story, but the prosecution. In order for the government to prevail, they had to prove their case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't have to prove our case. We just have to point out the holes in the prosecution story. So I want to go through some of those holes, some of those doubts, starting with the police investigation. Because you heard today from the prosecution that the first thing they had to prove to you is that a murder actually happened. Members of the jury, you heard from the lead investigator on this case that they never found a body. Now, on the stand, the detective tried to give us reasons for why that was. Tried to say that that was normal in an investigation, that it's hard to find in such a large area. But remember what else he told you. He told you that he knows where that body is. Is that reasonable? That the FBI knows exactly where a body is located, that they were able to track down the exact coordinates of its movements across hundreds of miles on the night of Mr. Clark's disappearance, but they couldn't find that body? Or is it more reasonable that the reason they couldn't find that body is that there never was one to begin with? That is reasonable doubt. You also heard that the FBI couldn't bring you any murder weapon in today's case. They're confident that it's a syringe Miss Bassett used, but they never located it. That missing bottle, they could never find it. And because they could never find that bottle, they could never test it for any fingerprints. They could never test it for any of Mrs. Bassett's DNA. And without that testing, members of the jury, they have no physical evidence connecting my client to this crime. That is reasonable doubt. Now, you also heard about some physical material that they say they collected from a wheelchair and some boots belonging to Miss Bassett. Members of the jury, again, you're going to get that toxicology report. And I want you to look at it very closely and read the line where they admit that they never tested that material against any other location, including Miss Bassett's own residence, her own animal park. And without that testing, they can't confirm that Miss Bassett ever left her home that night. That is reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, I want you to remember one fact in today's case that is completely uncontested. No one saw Miss Bassett commit this crime. You didn't hear that from any prosecution or any prosecution witness or any piece of evidence that the government brought you today. If the lead investigator on this case can't put Miss Bassett at the scene of the crime, if no witness that he interviewed could put Miss Bassett at the scene of the crime, if no one that the government brought you can put Miss Bassett at the scene of the crime when it was their sole burden to do so, then you can't either. That is reasonable doubt. They have the wrong story. So they have the wrong person. Find Miss Bassett not guilty.
Is there a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, Ms. Rahimzadeh just told you that we have the wrong story, so we have the wrong person. Members of the jury, there isn't another person who had the means and the motive and the opportunity to get rid of Dawn Clark. There wasn't another person who had access to that tranquilizer who also had a passion for changing the park from a zoo to a sanctuary, who also had access to the park's own van that drove 400 miles in the middle of the night on the day he went missing. There isn't another story. And while the defense doesn't have a burden in today's case, you can question whether what they're telling you is reasonable. Is it reasonable to believe that Dawn Clark might still be alive and may have flown when we know that he's gone? The state of Florida declared him dead. He's deceased. We know Dawn Clark is gone, just like we know the defendant killed for control. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Is there anything else before we go off the record?
No, Your Honor.
Not from the government, Your Honor.